Before we start, I think I want to just introduce a few people here that we have. Stein is not saying, is he going to introduce me? Of course. Don't worry about it. Senator Steinberg is actually the first one I have down here. Thank you very much for being here today. Speaker Bass, is she here? Yeah, right there, exactly. Thank you very much. Senator Hollandsworth is here, yes. And then we have, of course, our Ana Manda Santos, our Director of Finance, right standing next to me here. Mike Ginest is burned out, so he's taking a little vacation, so you know. And then we have, of course, my Chief of Staff, Susan Kennedy, right here in the front row, and my cabinet secretaries are scattered all over here on this side, all pumped up, of course. Then I think we have here Senator Maldonado. Is he here? Yeah, he's right over here. Very nice. Then our Budget Committee Chair, Senator Ducheney, is right here in the front row. Good to see you. And then we have Senator Dutton, also here, and Assemblywoman Evans, right there, okay, and the Assemblyman Nielsen, right, also here. And if I left anyone out, I want to apologize, but it's not on my card, so I blame my staff for it. Anyway, good morning, everybody. And today I'm presenting the legislature with my budget proposal for fiscal year of 2010-2011. Now, as you know, in just the last 12 months, we have solved a $60 billion deficit. Yet our hard work is not finished. This year we face another $19.9 billion shortfall, which is $6.6 billion for the current year and $13.3 billion for the next budget year. However, let me first start on a positive note, which is that we do see signs that our economy is beginning to stabilize. California's unemployment rate has begun to slowly tick downward. And while personal income still fell 2.8% in 2009, it's projected to grow by 2.4% in 2010, and 3.6% in 2011, and 4.8% in 2012. So for our economy, recovery is on the horizon. And I wish I could say this about our budget, but I can't. Tough times still lie ahead. Big picture, next budget year, we expect to have $85 billion in available revenues. Now, when I signed the budget last July, the operating shortfall for the next budget year was projected to be $6.9 billion. The gap has now grown to $19.9 billion for several reasons. This includes $3.4 billion in lower revenues, court decisions and litigations that have cost us $4.9 billion, and $2.3 billion in lost savings, largely due to the smaller prison package that the legislature has passed, and $1.4 billion in higher program costs and caseload growth due to the continued effects of the recession. When we include the $1 billion reserve, that leaves us $19.9 billion hole that we must fill over the next 18 months. The solution that I propose can be broken down in three pieces. The first piece is $8.5 billion in spending cuts, mostly to health and human services, employee compensation, and prisons. And in the fiscal emergency special session that I'm calling today, I'm asking the legislature to start many of these cuts in the current fiscal year. In health and human services, I propose $2.9 billion in cuts. This includes $1.1 billion in cuts to Medi-Cal from increasing cost sharing and reducing eligibility and combating fraud. $950 million in cuts to in-home supportive services by reducing the state's contribution to wages and reducing services. And $130 million in cuts to CalWorks by reducing grants so they're more in line with other high cost of living states. Now, in employee compensation, I propose $1.6 billion in cuts. This includes 5% payroll cap, a 5% salary reduction, and for all state employees, and a 5% increase in employees' retirement contributions. In prisons, I propose $1.2 billion in cuts. The bulk of these cuts, $811 million, comes from making our prison healthcare system more efficient and funding it at the level comparable to New York. I also propose to continue reducing our juvenile justice population, as well as our prison population, by housing some non-serious, non-violent offenders in county jails rather than in state prisons. I know many of these cuts are painful. Believe me, these are the hardest decision a governor must make. Yet, there's simply no conceivable way to avoid more cuts and more pain. However, when it comes to cuts, let me make one point very clear. Our state, our economy, and our future is so dependent on education that as far as I'm concerned, we must protect education. For kindergarten through 14, my budget fully funds the Proposition 98 guarantee, which is $50 billion. It also maintains the same level of funding for schools next year as we had this year. For higher education, my budget increase is funding $225 million increase. It is my hope that with this funding level, we can avoid any further fee increases. This brings me to the second piece of my budget, which is $4.5 billion in fund shifts and alternative revenues. This includes redirecting $1 billion from Proposition 10 and Proposition 63 to existing programs, redirecting $500 million that counties will save from our human services cuts to help fund foster care, and $200 million from my emergency response initiative to help fund CAL FIRE, and $200 million from the Terrankian Ridge offshore drilling project to fund state parks. And I also propose $986 million in revenues from a transportation funding swap, which of course Anna would then discuss into details later on. The third and the final piece of my budget is the $6.9 billion in federal funds. As I've said in my State of the State address, federal funds must be part of our budget solution because the federal government is part of our budget problem. During the Clinton administration, California got 94 cents on the dollar. We now only get 78 cents on the dollar. Texas is getting 94 cents, Florida 97 cents, and New Mexico gets more than $2. This should be more equitable. For example, right now, there are discriminatory formulas that force California to subsidize other states. In Medi-Cal, our matching fund rate is the lowest of any state. We get 50%. The national average is 57%. My budget proposal increases California's rate to the national average, which means an extra $1.8 billion. We are also asking the federal government to pay us what they owe us. My budget includes $1 billion for medical costs that should have been paid by Medicare. It also includes $1 billion that Washington owes us for various federal education mandates. And other big items, of course, is immigration. Immigration is a big item. The federal government alone controls immigration policies and border security. Therefore, my budget includes the $900 million in federal funds to cover the costs of incarcerating undocumented immigrants. As I said in my State of the State, we are not looking for federal bailout. We are looking for federal fairness. And we seek not just money. We also seek more flexibility to prioritize our own resources and manage our own budget. Right now, the federal government is forcing us to spend money we do not have. The federal court-appointed receiver is forcing us to spend 3 times more per inmate on medical care than in other states. Various federal rules are tying our hands and preventing us from reducing costs in some state programs. I want to remind the federal judges and the politicians that California is not Washington. We do not have the luxury of printing money or running trillion-dollar deficits. I know that many previous governors have tried very hard to get California a fair share from Washington, and they were not successful. Yet I promised the people of California that I will be relentless, that I will be fighting for that. In fact, later on this month, we will be traveling to Washington with the 4 legislative leaders here from California to fight for California. And I call upon California's congressional delegation, Democrats and Republicans alike, to join us in that fight. Together we can be a powerful voice that Washington cannot ignore. However, I want to be clear. that we are prepared in case that any of these federal solutions do not materialize. For each federal dollar that we fall short, we have a trigger list of additional cuts and revenues, which then Anna again will be elegantly explaining into details later on. Now, I know that the budget that I have laid out today is difficult and it is painful, but California is resilient. We know we will once again get through these tough challenges. And it's also important to note that all states are struggling in this economic crisis. As a matter of fact, all countries around the world are struggling with this economic crisis. As a matter of fact, there are many of the states that are in worse shape than us. But this is no reason for us to celebrate, because in California we always strive to be the best and to set the standard. And the fact is that right now there are many states that are in better shape than we are, facing deficits that are far more manageable. These states aren't talking about draconian cuts. They're not talking about gutting state programs. That is because those states have smart and more stable budget and tax systems. The reality is that California's broken budget and tax systems are the root of so much of this budget evil. Ever since I was elected governor, I've been trying to get budget reform and to get a rainy day fund. We haven't done it yet. We haven't accomplished those goals, but I will continue pushing for that and fighting for that. In my State of the State speech, I also talked about our broken tax system. Last year, California's economy dropped by 2.8%, yet our tax revenues were down 8 times that much. There is no way to run a state. The Tax Commission did its work and proposed major radical reforms. So I asked the legislature to work with me to get this done. We can do it. Because think about this. If my budget and tax reforms had been in place over the last 10 years, this year's deficit would have been $8 billion less. Another major area that we must reform is our pension system, whose costs have gone up by more than 2,000% in the last 10 years. From less than $150 million a year to more than $3 billion a year and growing fast. Also, we have to look at allowing private prisons to compete with public prisons, which would save us billions of dollars. And we must also repeal the law that prohibits schools from entering into public-private partnerships for construction, maintenance, and transportation services at the lowest possible costs. For years, Sacramento has failed to act on all of those reforms, and the people are paying a painful price. That is why in this budget, I refuse to raise taxes, because there are so many other areas where Sacramento can be smarter, more efficient, and save precious taxpayer dollars. We have a responsibility to take action here, because we have two choices. More and more of the same dysfunction, the same monster deficits, and the same budget roller coaster ride, or real reform. I say, let's choose real reform. It won't be easy, but California is the greatest state in the greatest country in the world. It is worth fighting for. And that's what the people expect us to do. Fight for California and fight for them. Now, I read a headline last week in the San Francisco Chronicle that read, "Angry voters tell the government, do something. Do something." So I asked the legislators to join me. Let's do something. Let's show to the people that by working together, what we can accomplish, that we can accomplish great things. Thank you very much. And now if you have any questions about that, feel free to ask.
Governor, I have a question over here. I have a question really quickly about the, is it on? About the federal money. How are you walking
Yes.
with the microphone?
There they are. We have the technology. No problem.
I want to ask you about the federal money that you're
Yes.
trying to get. You alluded to the fact that you've tried to get it before. You called yourself the collectinator in 2003. Haven't been able to get it yet. I talked to an economist this morning who said what you really should be doing is asking for a second federal stimulus program and joining with other governors across the country and saying we need it, rather than trying to complain about something that California hasn't gotten for all these years.
Well, first of all, because California hasn't gotten it for a few years, doesn't mean that we shouldn't complain and we shouldn't try to get the money. I think that it is my responsibility, and I promise the people of California that I will be fighting for California, and I will go and do everything that I can to get the federal money that we deserve. I think that the first stimulus package that we got was terrific, but it is one-time revenue. We are not looking for one-time revenue. We are not looking for two times revenue. We are looking for fairness. We are not looking for a bailout either. We're just looking for fairness, and it is not fair for California to get 78 cents in a dollar and to have New Mexico get $2.03. That has to stop. And as I said, it's the federal government's responsibility to take care of immigration policies and of our borders. So for them not to take care of their job well, and then for us to get stuck with the bill of incarceration of undocumented immigrants of $900 million is unfair. So we are all in sync. Democrats and Republicans alike here that can tell you, we're going to fly to Washington, we're going to fight for that money. And this is no reason because we didn't get it or because something hasn't been done not to do it. Now, of course, as you said, there's someone else that had a different idea. You know, something that you see here, maybe 100 or 200 people in here, they all maybe have different ideas, but this is the right thing to do, to fight for that money. And I never give in because something hasn't been done or we haven't accomplished it yet. Remember, my Uncle Teddy fought his entire life for health care reform. And he passed away, never saw it being reformed. So it doesn't mean that he should have stopped 20 years ago, 30 years ago. He was relentless. And I will be relentless to get money for California because it's our money. We are paying for it. We are not asking the federal government to give us something. It's our money. And I expect our congressional delegation, bipartisan delegation, to fight for California rather than for the federal government. That's it.
They're far larger than any other state prisons, and they're very overcrowded. Why not spare some of these drastic cuts to health and human services and instead comply with that federal court order to reduce the prison population?
Well, first of all, we are working with the federal judges, and it has not come full circle yet. So we've been working with them. We try to resolve this. We try to have, those reforms and to get some of those that are not high risk, that are low risk, nonviolent offenders to go to local institutions and all of this. So we're working on all of this stuff. So I think that you have seen, and when you look at the budget, you will see certain cuts in prisons that are reasonable, and I think that we can manage. And as you know, that we are having a problem here of almost $20 billion. So you can talk about the $500 million here, the $300 million there, but $20 billion, the reality of it is let's focus on one thing. And that is we are making all of these cuts that we don't really want to make because we have a lack of money, because we have a flawed budget system and we have a flawed tax system. And so we got to fix those things because I'm more concentrating now not just on fixing the budget for this year, but to think about how do we protect ourselves from the future, because this is a state, if you compare it to an intersection, it's like seeing people crashing into each other and never building a stop sign and never building a traffic light. And see them over and over hurting themselves and killing themselves. That's what's going on in California right now. Year after year, we know that our budget system doesn't work. As I've said, with a drop in the economic drop of 2.8%, and then all of a sudden we have a 24% drop in our revenues, there's something terribly wrong. We are relying too much on income tax and on capital gains tax, and that is relying on the Wall Street economy rather than on California's economy. So we got to change some of those things.
Governor, can I ask you about state worker cuts?
Yes.
Why are you ending the furloughs, and is that an admission that they were wrong-headed? And also, do you plan to negotiate your pay cuts with the union groups?
Well, I don't think that it says anywhere we are ending anything. The furlough is for 1 year. The fiscal year is over in 6 months from now, and then the other things will be kicking in. So everything is on the program. There were some losses and some gains when it comes to the furloughs, which of course, always happens. And I think that those lawsuits that sometimes hurting our budget and hurting programs, they're always good for the people that file the lawsuits, but they're not good for the state of California. That I can guarantee you. And when it comes to state employees, let me make one thing clear, that I appreciate very much the hard work that state employees do. They work very hard and doing a great job to make the state run. But at the same time, we have had a drop because of the economic crisis worldwide, where everything all of a sudden became 1/3 less in value. And the private sector got hit very hard. People got unemployed with a 12.5% unemployment rate. People had to take reductions in their salaries and all of those things. And so the public sector also has to take a haircut. And I have made it very clear to the labor leaders that I don't want to see anyone get laid off. I don't want anyone to get fired. But instead, let's all reduce the wages. Let's go and have furlough days, and let's go and reduce our wages and just spread the pain evenly, because I just didn't want to see anyone go home without their paycheck and being able to take care of the family. And so that was the idea of the furloughs, that we all take a little bit of the pain and the haircut. And so this is how we will go on, where everyone is going to chip in and do something, so we don't have to go in the direction of laying people off and firing people and all that.
So will you be negotiating these proposals directly with the unions?
No, I will be working with the legislative leaders and with the legislators, and we will be working together, and we will get this done.
Are you bringing back the property tax?
Yes.
The property insurance tax, are you bringing that back?
Say again?
Are you bringing back the surcharge on the property insurance premiums? If so, why are you not calling that a tax?
No, because you mean you're talking about the $200 million, the emergency. You're talking about the emergency. Yep, that is it's a fee. We consider the fee. I mean, this again against that. I let some people debate over that. What's a fee and what's a tax? But I mean, I call it a fee, and it's going to be. We look for that increase because it will help CAL FIRE and it will help our emergency response initiative and emergency services. We have more and more fires now, and therefore we need the extra money.
Last question, please. Governor, you're proposing to eliminate the sales tax on gasoline and replace it with a higher excise tax, and the net effect would one of the net effects would be to reduce the Proposition 98 guarantee by almost $1 billion. Is that consistent with your pledge to hold the line and protect education funding?
It is holding the line on our priorities. Remember what I said in my State of the State speech. This is the year where priorities will be very important. And I think my priority is to protect education funding and to make sure that we have enough for higher education, because this is the future. The children are our future. And I think that the key thing for us is to manage this crisis and this reduction in revenues in such a way that where we go and look creatively in other areas, and this is why I pointed out, for instance, to look at the pensions of public employees, where we can save money by working to find a way of changing the formula for new employees, and to go in that direction so that we can go and fulfill our commitment that we made to them, but lower the costs, and so that the taxpayers don't have to pay this extra billions of dollars, which then is money that is being taken away from other programs. And the other thing that you see in this budget is that I refuse to raise taxes in this budget, because there's no reason for us to raise taxes when there's all this extra money still around out there, especially in the prison system and in the public pensions, where we can save billions and billions of dollars. So this is why we're going in that direction. And I'm, again, like I said, looking forward, working with the legislators. They will have different ideas about a lot of those things. But, Democrats and Republicans last year did an extraordinary job. $60 billion we worked out on solutions. And so this is $20 billion, and it's going to be tough. But because there's a will there to make it work, we're going to make it work. And so I'm looking forward working with the legislators. And, and I think that the key thing also is, as I said earlier, that we start making mid-year cuts now. I mean, I wish we can just sit down for the next 2 weeks and work that out very quickly, because the faster we make the cuts now, because this year is $6.6 billion in that we are spending too much. This is $600 million a month right now that we are spending that we do not have. So the faster we can make mid-year cuts, the more we can then help the budget year for the coming budget year that starts on July 1. So this is there's a lot of work ahead. So I'm looking forward to that. So again, thank.
Children are our future. How can you eliminate cowards and shred the safety net for almost 1 million poor children? You say children are our future. Well, you obviously don't mean poor children.
As you just identified, that yes, you're right. I did say that children are my priority, and they will continue being my priority. As a matter of fact, I was so excited yesterday that we showed that the state of California showed that the children are our priority when we had education reform. Reform in education that no one thought would be possible, but the legislators did it. It was a huge, huge victory where Democrats and Republicans came together. And when you have a $20 billion loss in revenues, then you have to, again, have priorities and you have to make choices. And let me tell you something, a lot of the cuts that you see in this budget, under normal circumstances, we wouldn't make those cuts. We would not make those cuts because I call them draconian cuts, very painful cuts. And so this is why I think we have to fix our budget system and we have to fix our tax system. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Anna. Now I would like to bring out Anna to say a few words about the budget and to go into details, please. And by the way, we have Anna's parents. Where are Anna's parents?
They're over there.
Sitting. Oh, we're right over here. Let's give them a big hand. For creating such a wonderful genius, the first Latina finance director in the history of California. Thank you very much for creating her. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you, Governor. I want to first thank my colleagues at the Department of Finance, 400 talented, smart, hardworking individuals and public servants with whom I have the pleasure to work with, and I want to thank my family as well. I just want to talk to you a little bit about some of the issues the Governor said I'd provide additional detail on, a little bit about how the problem developed, and then some of the proposed solutions. As the Governor said, our problem definition is $19.9 billion. We started with a projected problem last year for this year of $6.9 billion. We add to that problem a couple of factors. The first, as the Governor mentioned, is $4.9 billion in costs associated with court decisions and litigation. That's litigation in the area of transportation, the impact of litigation on the sale of the State Compensation Insurance Fund, additional litigation costs in the area of health and human services, as well as other areas. The next piece is an erosion in some of the solutions adopted last year, and the biggest erosion pieces there are in the area of corrections. It's about $1 billion in corrections, and then it's another $1 billion associated with Medicaid flexibility being one time instead of ongoing. That amount is $2.3 billion. The revenue decline, while revenues are starting to grow year over year, and we have some growth in our estimates. The decline is a total decline of $3.4 billion across the 3 years from our prior projections. And lastly, we have other population and caseload growth increases across the budget that add $1.4 billion to our problem. Rebuilding the reserve then gets us to the 19.9. Now on solutions. Expenditure reductions. We have a total of $8.5 billion in expenditure reductions. As the Governor said, $2.9 billion of those are in the area of health and human services. I'll start with Medi-Cal, which comprises about $1.1 billion of those solutions. The first one is $750 million to be achieved through a combination of utilization controls, so that's like looking at limits within a benefit. So changing the number of prescriptions, for example, that we cover in a month, or changing the level of service that we provide for physician services, et cetera. It's also looking at potential for additional cost sharing. And it's looking at some of the things that other states are doing in that area. And the last piece is looking at other efforts to be able to address some rate pressure. So that gives us $750 million in savings. The other components are a combination of different things. The biggest one is a proposal that will be familiar to you from prior budgets, which is the rollback of expansion of healthcare services to newly qualified immigrants that was done after the federal government made these immigrants ineligible for federal programs in 1996. In addition, there's a rollback of a recent increase in rates for family planning services, as well as some deferrals within those amounts. The next largest component is in-home supportive services. The proposal there is the same proposal as last May revision. It's $951 million in savings associated with two pieces. The first is a reduction in the rate to which the state participates in local wages, locally negotiated wages. The second piece is providing services to the neediest individuals, and that's individuals who are assessed as having a need of 4 or higher based on the assessment for the program. In the CalWorks program, as the governor mentioned, there's a $130 million reduction associated with reducing grants by 15.7%, which is the average rate of 10 other high cost of living areas. There's also reductions to child care rates and reimbursements, and there's also a reduction to services provided to recent legal immigrants residing in California who arrived more. Well, I already said recent, so we'll skip that. The SSI SSP program. There's two proposals in the SSI SSP area. The first is consistent with prior proposals to reduce SSI SSP grants to the federal maintenance of effort level, to the federal minimum. We're already at the federal minimum for couples. This impacts individuals. The second proposal is an elimination of the cash assistance program for immigrants. The combined effect of those two proposals is roughly $300 million. There's reductions to the Department of Developmental Services, extension of some existing reductions in that area as well. It is an additional target to work with stakeholders to achieve additional savings in this program. In the Healthy Families program, there's a proposal to reduce eligibility to 200% of poverty. Current level is 250% of poverty, as well as a proposed elimination for the vision benefit and increases in cost sharing within that program. Those are, I think, many of the Health and Human Services proposals that comprise the 2.9. Now on to employee compensation. As the governor said, there's $1.6 billion in employee compensation reductions. Of those, 1.4 are roughly achieved through three proposals. The first is an across-the-board pay reduction of 5%. The second is a 5% increase in the employee contribution towards retirement. And the last is a 5% reduction to each department's payroll. And the idea here is each department director will submit it, this proposal will start now. And during this fiscal year, each department director will develop a proposal and a plan to be able to achieve this reduction, submit the plan to the governor, and initiate implementation of that plan in this year to achieve full year value next year. That can be achieved through a combination of approaches such as attrition, different staffing, and potentially some position eliminations. Other reductions, as the governor mentioned, in the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, there are two large reductions. The first is an $811 million reduction by getting the receiver to reduce California's prison health care cost to the level of New York. This is New York is the state that we're choosing, given the fact that it has a population similar to California and it has a higher rate of expenditures than other states. It's not in a situation of a receivership, and we believe that there are many things that can be done in California to eliminate duplication of services and to achieve this level of savings. There's also additional reforms in the area of corrections, as the governor spoke to. There's savings associated with nonviolent, the least risk level of offenders serving their sentences, people who come to prison for a short period of time, serving those sentences locally instead of coming to state prison, as well as additional reductions in the juvenile population. In the area of there's suspensions of mandates and deferrals of additional payments in that area that yields $232 million in savings. The other component is, as the governor said, the funding for Proposition 98 would basically remain level. It increases from 49.9 to $50 billion year over year. And there's a savings of $2.4 billion associated with maintaining education at the same level and not providing a greater increase that the no action approach would require. Yes. Higher education, as the governor mentioned, funding increases year over year by $224.5 million. There's also, higher education had a reduction this year of $305 million by segment, for a total of $610 million. That reduction that was this year that was intended to be backfilled with federal funds was one time, and it's being restored going forward. Now on to federal flexibility. As the governor says, the budget proposes $6.9 billion in additional federal funds to offset general fund costs. The bulk of these funds are dollars owed to California. It's California getting either the level of funding that the federal law has stated that the state would get, or the level of funding comparable to what other states are currently receiving. I'll first talk about the health and human services components. The first one is an increase in the level of matching fund and what we call the base FMAP for the Medicaid program from the current rate of 50% to 57%. 57% is both the national average as well as the average of the most populous states. We're not asking to go to the highest. We're not asking to go to Ohio or to Texas, who are at 61%, but merely to go to the national average for savings of $1.8 billion. In the Medi-Cal area, there are some dollars owed to the state that the federal government, in some cases, has recognized and identified the issue and recognized that it's dollars owed to the state. The first, this will provide $1 billion in additional relief, $700 million of which is associated with Medi-Cal paying for costs that should have been paid by Medicare. In the area of foster care, we're looking to have the federal government participate in funding all the foster care costs that it holds us accountable for. Currently, the formulas look back to what the state spent in what people's incomes were in 1996. So over years, what happens is the effective rate of how much the federal government pays for is decreasing. We're merely looking to have the federal government participate in all of our foster care caseload. That it provides $94 million in additional funding. Lastly, we're assuming that the federal government is going to continue to provide additional assistance to states similar to what they did in the Recovery Act in the area of health and human services. This is consistent with the House of Representatives' acknowledgement that states need additional assistance, and many of the proposals included in the House jobs package. In the area of special education, current federal law contemplates that the federal government would pay for 40% of the cost of federal special education mandates. However, historically, the federal government has funded well below that level. We're asking for an additional $1 billion in direct reimbursements to the states, consistent with the level with what the federal law calls for. Lastly, as the governor stated, we're looking for the federal government to fully fund the cost of incarcerating undocumented immigrants, and that provides $879.7 million. As the governor said, I was going to speak a little bit to the trigger, so I will do that. And as he stated, California is, we're confident that we're going to achieve these federal funds. We have a record of success. Last year, we said we were going to get $1 billion in additional Medicaid funding, and people had a lot of skepticism about that. This year, we're on track to get $800 million of that. Several years ago, the governor set out to get additional federal funding for the In-Home Supportive Services program, and today we're saving $1.5 billion over the life of the waiver associated with additional federal funding for our In-Home Supportive Services program. The trigger is basically a safety valve. It's comprised of reductions and revenues. It's about 2/3, 1/3 in terms of the amount, and it equals essentially the amount of money that is included in the federal funds. So it's 6.9, 6.9. Many of the items identified in the trigger are identified in the trigger because they're within the control of the state, and there are things that the state can do without changes in federal law. So you see included in the trigger are some program eliminations, CalWORKs, in-home supportive services, healthy families, additional reductions to the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, basically expanding the list of crimes for which people would serve time locally, additional reductions to rehabilitation programs, etc. There's an additional 5% employee reduction in the trigger, as well as some extensions of either two existing revenues, as well as delays in scheduled tax cuts. There's more detail about the trigger cuts and the trigger revenues in your package, and I'm happy to answer any questions on that side. Alternative funding and fund shifts, it's $4.5 billion. A big component is the transportation funding proposal. And basically what this proposal does is, we started with talking about the impact to our budget associated with court decisions. $2 billion of that $4.9 billion is roughly associated with the Shaw decision, where the court invalidated the state's use of public transportation funds for a variety of public transportation services that would otherwise be funded by the federal funds. Basically what the proposal does is it looks at a way to achieve a level of savings that is, as comparable with what was done in the Budget Act as possible in light of this court decision. So there are two main funding streams for, there are two taxes that are funding transportation services. One is an excise tax that is, and here's the chart that tells you what the current world looks like. The left-hand side of the chart has the 18 cents per gallon, which is money that's constitutionally protected for roads. It's the excise tax. It's a flat per amount. It's 18 cents. The right-hand side has the state sales tax on fuels, and this is funding that goes to the public transportation account as well as to Prop 42 and the highways. Basically, the combined impact of these two is currently estimated at being about 34 cents per gallon in terms of what consumers are paying at the pump. What the proposal does is, now you see what the world looks like post. On the left-hand side, what the proposal does is it eliminates the sales tax on fuels and replaces it with, in part, an 11 cent, it's 10.8 cent increase in the excise tax to fully fund the road component that was funded at the same level funded in the Budget Act for roads, for Prop 42, and it distributes it in the same way in which the money is currently going out in the Budget Act. And then the second piece is it increases, it provides sufficient excise tax revenues to pay for the Prop 1B debt service. The balance is is a tax cut and a tax reduction to consumers of roughly $1 billion or 5 cents per gallon. Additionally, there are savings associated with dollars currently in the public transit account being used to fund transit debt service. And if I've gotten you sufficiently confused and I haven't explained it greatly, my colleague Mark Hill will bail me out and help me here explain it in a manner that will help with questions. So the other component has been noted is the excise tax is not a general proceed of a tax and is not accounted for purposes of Proposition 98. So a byproduct of this proposal is a reduction in the Prop 98 guarantee of $836 million. Other fund shifts are, there's $1 billion in alternative funding associated with going back to the ballot in June on Proposition 10 and Proposition 63, and being able to access existing reserves to provide funding for services to a variety of services in children's programs, as well as mental health services for children through the EPSDT program. That's another $1 billion. And as the governor mentioned, the Emergency Response Initiative is also proposed to provide $200 million in funding to CAL FIRE. There's also a proposal to do alternative speed enforcement. It's basically looking at monitoring, being able to enforce traffic laws and enforce speeding violations, and this funding is going to help support trial courts. There's some proposals to address issues having to do with the recycling program and reforms to both start repayments of the fund to be able to restart program, as well as some changes going forward to reform the program, focus on the recycling programs that are most effective, et cetera. Lastly, just a quick word on cash. Our current projections are that this year we're going to have no problems relative. We have sufficient cash by the end of the year to be able to fully pay for the RANS repayments that are due in May and due in June. March is going to be we're going to be limited on cash in March, and we're going to be below the controller's stated cushion of $2.5 billion. So we'll be needing about $1 billion in cash solutions in March to be able to handle that month. We also have cash challenges come July. We're working with the controller and with the treasurer on additional cash solutions at the governor's direction to be able to be presented to the legislature in the special session. Not looking at the cash situation of last year, but looking at still a difficult year, and as the governor has mentioned, a need for quick action to be able to both address our budget problem, manage our cash situation, and be able to limit the amount of additional cuts that would be necessary if we have erosions in any of the proposed solutions. So with that, I'll take your questions. So the proposals in the special session, the governor's calling a special session today. He's submitting his plan to address the identified gap to the legislature today. The legislature has 45 days to act. The solutions in the special session will have a full year value of $8.9 billion. And basically, the governor is proposing that the legislature act on many of the cuts to be able to ensure that we get a full year value associated with those. Action that does not occur until July means that those solutions lose about $2.4 billion. So it means that many more cuts associated with delays. A combination of different cuts. It's many of the reductions in health and human services, action on the transportation proposal, action on the Proposition 98 solutions, and action on the emergency response initiative, and alternative speed enforcement, et cetera, to make sure that we get the maximum value from those solutions.
What would be part of the 2.4 that you would lose?
There's the places where you have, it depends on places where you have substantial erosions with the passage of time, as in health and human services and in corrections, because you have a relatively longer lead time to be able to implement those. Similarly, there's going to be a lead time for the emergency response initiative, so there's an impact there. The Proposition 98 changes have to occur before June 30th. Any big ones I missed? All right.
Questions?
Yes.
Last year, to close the budget gap, there were some measures taken which included increased withholding and also moving pay period into the next year. Does this budget also move pay period in the next year?
It's retaining. Last year's change was permanent, and this budget is not changing it. It's a permanent change going forward. It provided a one-time benefit. So those things remain in effect. They don't provide an additional budgetary value this year.
So it's 12 pay periods, not 13 this year?
Yeah, it's yeah.
And the second question is, when you talk about moving more prisoners into the county system, do you have a number as to the cost that will bring to the counties?
We have an estimate of the savings associated with it. And
Dollar for dollar, the same difference? I mean, every dollar saved for the state is paid for the county?
Counties have different rules than the state does relative to how they handle their population. So we can speak, and it's going to vary by different jurisdictions. So, and counties will manage the population. We can speak to the state savings in the way that's best for us to account for.
Can you go over the cuts in the corrections department? We have the 811 to the health care.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. 811 to healthcare. 1 second. The remainder is about 356 million. I'm going to do it from memory until I find the page. Juvenile population piece is about $40 million. The bigger reduction comes from having more people spend time locally. C, can you say it off the top? Yeah. Thank you. If you look at general fund spending, it's about $2 billion. If you look at actual expenditure solutions, it's about 1.2. So their general fund is being brought down by two factors: the expenditure solutions plus the additional federal funds for the cost of incarcerating undocumented immigrants.
How would the trigger work if you only got some of the federal funds? Is there a priority list, or is this non-negotiable?
The trigger is basically a determination on July 15th, and it's dollar for dollar. The plan is to get the federal funds. So the budget assumes the federal funds. Then it provides for things that can happen in the alternative that it doesn't. Exactly what the trigger looks like will be an item that the governor will be working with the legislature on, and that will be refined as the process moves on, May revision, and as we have more and more progress on the federal fund side. The PTA basically we eliminate the sales tax on fuels, so that would be the fund source. So there's money in the PTA from the dollars that are going into the PTA this year, and those dollars are being spent over time. But the fund source that supplies the PTA going forward would be going away. The first, below the cushion.
$200 million is expected from drilling off Santa Barbara. What happens to the parks budget if that money doesn't come, the legislature doesn't approve that piece?
The parks budget would be fully funded in both alternatives. You mentioned the legislature. We're actually looking at the State Lands Commission as the place where the lease would be approved. If it's not approved by the State Lands Commission, then we'd be looking to the legislature to pass a bill. But parks is funded either way. Yeah, John?
On that, how do you get 200 versus it used to be 100? T-Ridge?
2 years.
2 years. So the rest of this fiscal year and...
You got it.
When you talk about external borrowing, what form of borrowing are you talking about, and what kind of scale?
It's external borrowing, basically the same borrowing that the state does every year in the fall. And we're looking at external financing of $10 billion that we'd be looking to borrow from the market come August. Sorry, hold on. Let me go to people in the back. And Karen's going to help you with this one.
Underground storage tank owners pay fees into
basically, at this juncture, we're not assuming those dollars. We're continuing to pursue the litigation, but until there's a final opinion at the end of the litigation, we wouldn't be able to get the financing done. So that would mean going all the way, likely, I mean, if there's appeals, et cetera, going all the way to the Supreme Court. So our assessment is that it would take more than this year at least, and I think our attorney would say at least 2 in order for that to occur. So we're looking at an out-year issue on that one.
You talked about the $6.9 billion that the federal government owes the state of California. Now, a large part of that is actually money that they send under the existing rules. Is there money that the federal government actually agrees is owed to the state of California and that they agree that they have to pay?
As I mentioned, the bulk of the money is associated with money owed, but it's not all of it. Basically, the clearest components, special education. Federal law says when the mandates were done that they were going to pay for 40% of the cost. They're not paying for 40% of the cost. In the case of compensating the state for undocumented immigrants, federal government says that they would pay for the cost or they would take the population. They're not doing that. So it's money owed to the state.
Except you've been fighting over that money for illegal immigration for better than 10 years now. Is there actually money? I believe you mentioned something about some of the Medicare money that the state actually, you and the feds have actually gotten together and said, okay, we agree we'll owe this money and we're actually going to pay it.
Yes, I mean, that's the case, for example, where the federal government has agreed that they owe the dollars. They haven't appropriated the funds to pay us yet.
You mentioned accessing funds from Prop 63 and Prop 10. I assume that would require another ballot measure.
Vote of the people in June, and that's another item that's in part of the special session in order to make sure that that happens in a timely manner. Yes.
Can you tick off what the things are they added to the $4.5 billion in fund shifts?
Sure. Sure. $1 billion for transportation, roughly. $1 billion for 63 and 10. $200 million for T-Ridge. $200 million for the Emergency Response Initiative. Now I'm going to have to look up the other ones because I don't remember them off the top. It's $357 for alternative speed enforcement. For alternative speed enforcement, I got a list right here. And then this is also a May revision proposal. Counties, when we make reductions in in-home supportive services and other areas that are funded jointly by the state and the counties achieve savings. We're looking to capture those savings to fund increased costs in the foster care, child welfare services, and other programs. So that one is $505 million. There's some increases in the penalty assessments, DNA penalty assessments to fund programs within the Department of Justice. That's roughly $60 million. And the last piece is the legislature approved a shift of redevelopment funds in 1011 to schools. The budget proposes to not shift those dollars to schools, but instead to shift it to trial courts, and that's $350 million out of that total. There's continuation of a shift from tribal revenues to fund to the general fund for from transportation bonds that haven't been yet sold. That's continuation of something from last year. And we have a second publication that I think you'll pick up on the way out, and in the back of it is a list of all the solutions that may be a quicker reference than the 8 pages for you. We're submitting language to the legislature today on everything that's a special session item.
Can you talk more about that? Speed enhancements. What is that? Where is it in here?
You would find it. Let's see, what page is it on? It's in the switches at the top of the book. Basically, it's looking at installing, having the locals install a device. Likely, this is something other states are doing. And if you look at a device that gets installed into red light cameras, for example, and it monitors speed, and it has a differential So we basically would the device would we assume we'd have 500 statewide, and the device basically clocks speed. There's a differential for the size of the fine associated with depending on how fast people are going. 85% of the dollars would come to the state, 15% of the dollars would remain to local revenues. The 85% of those dollars would be used to pay courts funding in the trial, to provide funding to the trial courts and have some general fund savings. And there's a little bit of an increase in the about $40 million of these revenues are being used to fund additional court security, which is an area that the administrative officers of the court have been highlighting as needing additional funding for. All right.
That's it. Thank you all very much because our staff.
Thanks. Thank you.